Hey, Ale, thank you so much for joining us for today's show. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Gaurav, it's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So tell me something about yourself that you would like to share with our audience as well.
Sure. I mean, for me, I say, since ever I can remember, I've always been really fascinated by people. Like, people are strange. People are wonderful. People are weird. All these things about people. And why do people do what they do? And it started ever since I was a child. And I got interested in human psychology at a very early time. And as I grew older, I found after doing a bit of personal growth work, I discovered that I had this mission in the world, this purpose, which was to create this vibrant and alive world by kindling the fire of brilliance in people.
Hmm.
And I'm really grateful because I found that mission when I was 25 years old, and I'm almost 52 now. So that's going on 27 years. And I feel grateful that both in my personal and professional life, I get to live that out. I work with people, whether it's personally or in organizations, to help them to touch that brilliance. I think we are all capable of so much. And I seek to help people draw out the greatness that's already there. So that's kind of what makes me tick. But
That's
I'm
inspiring. So
yeah,
you've been doing this work for 27 years, you said?
yeah, 27 years.
Wow. Wow. So, Ali, help me understand. Could you remember a story from your life, early childhood days that has left a deep impact on who you are as an individual today?
Oh yeah, for sure. So it's funny because when you're a child, you think that your experience is normal because it's all you know. You don't stop and think about it. But there's something about my childhood that was very unusual that I didn't realize was so unusual. So I was raised. My parents divorced when I was very young. That's not very unusual. That happens to a lot of people. I was raised by my mom, single mom, and my grandmother, her mother, and that again, not particularly unusual. The unusual part, Gaurav, is that my mother and my grandmother are both Holocaust survivors. So my mother's born in Belgium. They're Jewish,
Mm,
and
mm,
she was born in 1935, my mother. And Belgium was invaded by the Nazis in 1942. And then from 42 until the end of the war, my mother was hidden away through the Belgian underground, away from her family, with foster parents. She was put in convents. She had her hair dyed blonde. She was given a false identity and
mhm,
told she had a false name. And at the same time, her mother was also in hiding. And her mother, my grandmother, was actually captured and imprisoned and was supposed to go. And I've actually seen the documentation that's still in the archives. My grandmother, on the paper, her name, Esther Zandberg, number 181, scheduled to go out on the next transport train to Auschwitz. And
mm,
luckily, that train never left. And so the
mm,
two of them were reunited after the war. Most of the rest of the family was killed.
mm.
As you can imagine, that experience deeply shaped their view of the world. So if we talk about ideas of trust, well, for them, trust was very low. They did not want to trust the outside world. And they literally came from this survivalist mentality because they were literally being hunted for their lives. So as you can imagine, that very much informed how they raised me. And I grew up in the 1970s in New York City. And so I had a very different experience living at home with my family. I have an older brother, by the way. He's 3 years older than me. And very different experience at home than I did when I was at school or with my friends or my friends' houses. And I think early on, I think humans, we search for meaning and understanding. And I was trying to make sense of how these two things could be so different from each other. And I think that's what really got me interested in human psychology because, frankly, my grandmother, she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. She was very depressed and she would sometimes be really quiet and then she would get really angry. And then I didn't know what as a kid, you think, what did I do? And I really hadn't done anything, but I didn't know that. And it was a very challenging experience. Now, I don't blame my mother and my grandmother. I mean, this is the experience they had and they were doing the best they could. It wasn't until I had some distance from that later on that I realized how challenging it was for them. And so that's a pretty powerful experience, I think, that shaped my view of how
Mm.
the world was. And I also realized that's not the way it needed to be. I'm sure you're familiar with the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search
Man's
for
search
Meaning.
for meaning.
And obviously Frankl spent time in Auschwitz and he wrote about how the only thing that got him to survive that horrible place was imagining himself on a lecture stage telling other people about the experience and how humans have the capacity to choose. And his famous quote is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in
Mm.
that space is our power to choose. And in
Yeah.
that choice lies our freedom. And
Mm.
that quote has inspired me in that sense of helping people to kindle the fire of their own brilliance, because I think for a lot of us, we don't even recognize when we're trapped in our own cages. And so helping people to look at our own beliefs and see what are the things that get in our way. And then once we can remove those blocks,
Mm.
how much more powerful we are in the world and how much more fun we have living
Mm.
life.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Hey, Ali, thank you so much for sharing this. And I'm just wondering, so the story that you have just shared and the context that you were born in,
yes.
what were those initial assumptions and beliefs that you were struggling with?
Yeah.
And you took your own sweet time to get out of that, because I'm sure awareness does not come that early and that soon as well, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy for you right now to reflect, look back and say, this is what happened. And then I made this choice. And I'm
Yep.
sure between that stimulus and your response,
There was a lot going on in between.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Great
So if you can,
question. So some of the assumptions that I made, well, for one thing, because home life was so chaotic, I was looking for structure. And where I found structure was in school. So I was a very good student. And it was very important for me to get good grades because in my belief system, if I did a good job in school, therefore, then I would be love worthy, right? I would be affirmed. And so I kept doing that. And I would get a little bit of that, enough reinforcement that set me on this path. So I thought, gosh, if I could just do well, do a good job, that will work. And one thing that I noticed, and this became a handicap later on, was I carried this belief that good work should speak for itself and that you shouldn't speak about yourself because that's boasting and bragging, that you should keep your head down and, and do that. So I did that for many years. And I had this wonderful coach that once told me, he said, if good work spoke for itself, the entire field of marketing would not exist. Right? So the fact is, you need both. You need to have good work, and you need to let the world know that that exists. So that's one of the things that for
mm,
sure influenced me growing up, was this sense of just trying to do things right and looking for structure and also looking for external validation. Because frankly, I was too unconscious to be able to really deal with a lot of what was going on inside of me during those times early on.
mm, mm, yeah. What was the impact of these beliefs on the way you grew up, the way you dealt with your friends? Because I'm sure this experience was not at all common to your friends.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. So one of the beliefs that I remember actually hearing this word for word was, don't ever share any information unless someone asks you for it, right? Because it's this, you give as minimum as you can, and you make other people probe deeply, which meant I was actually quite reserved. It's interesting. You're probably familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And when I test for introvert versus extrovert, I come out as this weird mix because I think naturally I would be an extrovert. But because of my upbringing, I learned how to rein those extroverted, outgoing tendencies in. Because for me, I noticed that I really, and this is still something I find to this day, is unless I feel really safe with someone, I don't feel comfortable sharing. I kind of want them to share first. There's no accident that I got involved in the field that I'm in, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me. So I think one of the beliefs was, and I saw with my friends, is I was not particularly revealing of my inner life at all. I wasn't particularly honest with them. Not that we talked a whole lot about it, but
Yeah.
at those moments. And the other thing I didn't do is I didn't do a very good job, particularly I think back to my friends from growing up and then high school and then beyond. Maintaining relationships was not something that I
Mm,
ever thought to do, because again, I came from this very close knit, my mother, my grandmother, they didn't really have a lot of family or circle of friends. They were very insular. So I didn't have a lot of modeling of, you can reach out. There's a whole world out there. You can make friends and build a whole tribe and community together. And I didn't do any of that. And I didn't
yeah.
know that those were things that even got done because I had so little modeling of that.
Yeah. This is very interesting, Elliot. As I'm just listening to you, one of the beliefs that I have been brought up is that in case I share the information, the other person might snatch it from me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you might not be able to get what you really deserve and desire for yourself. So from the very starting, I remember that I'll just hide things from others,
Hmm.
right? Because I had this fear that in case I shared that, the other person might snatch it from me.
Yeah.
And I'll not be able to do justice to what I'm here for, and the other person would win. And that led to a lot of competitiveness within myself. So I'll work really hard at the cost of relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering now if that is the context that you were born in. And I'm
Hmm.
sure there are several other people in this world who are born in certain contexts without even awareness. So, by God's grace, by the universe grace, you have this awareness.
Yeah.
You chose to work on that.
Yes.
But I'm sure there are so many people out there in the world. They are born in this kind of a context and they're not even aware of that. What do you think? How would a person who is born and brought up in this kind of context, what kind of impact would it have on himself and on the people around him?
Well, for one thing, I think if we're born into this and we don't have the awareness and the context, it's like you were saying, Gaurav, is this sense of, I think there's this inner perpetual motion to continue to go and drive and try to achieve something and to keep going. And the problem with that is as you continue to try, you achieve whatever it was. I mean, for me, for example, I graduated the top of my high school class. So I was what we call the valedictorian. And I do that, but it didn't fill me up inside. Then it's the next thing and then the next thing. And I think for many people who are just striving, it's like we get these achievements, but when we achieve them, it's hollow. We don't really feel like we can celebrate it because we aren't open to the full experience of feeling. So I think that's one of the things that really gets in the way. And I think, we all need to hit. My colleague Tasha Eurich writes this in her book Insight, which you might be familiar with. She talks about one of the things around self-awareness is that we have these alarm clock moments, right? When the alarm clock goes off, and that it can be a wake-up call and going, this isn't working anymore. And some people have that from the inside, some people get that from the outside. And I think that unless we get to this place where we go, this isn't working anymore, we'll just keep going and going and going. And I think, for anyone who's listening right now, just the fact that you're listening right now means that you already are willing to consider pressing pause on the treadmill of going, 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 to stop and reflect, where am I getting to and why? And is where I'm trying to get to and where I'm putting all this effort into, is that really where I want to end up? Because I'm a huge fan of effort. I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think you just sit and just wait for things to happen. I mean, hard work is really important, but hard work needs to be aligned with mission and purpose.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing where I'd start, is just the willingness to press pause and reflect.
So well explained, Ali. Thank you so much. And I often share with people that either you can put in efforts from a space of fear, from fear-based beliefs, or some limiting values that you're operating from, or you can operate from a space of purpose and passion. And that's going to make all the difference.
Yes.
And as you said, at times it's okay to take a pause and reflect and check within yourself that if something is not working, where am I operating from?
Yeah.
What needs to shift within me that might create a different future for myself?
As you say that, what that makes me think about too, slightly different words, is my overall belief system one operating from a sense of lack and scarcity, or is it operating from the sense of enough and abundance? And I'm amazed at how many people I talk to. The constant theme is when they wake up in the morning, the first thought is, oh my gosh, I have so much to get done today. And then the last thought they have before they fall asleep is, I didn't get enough done, right? So it's this constant cycle of trying to play catch up and never really, because it's not enough. I mean, what is enough? What is it, what we're trying to get to? And it's so easy, particularly in the modern world, to think that, because it used to be, before we had all this technology, you could only compare yourself to the people you could see, who were a few miles from around you. But now we have the option. We can compare ourselves to anybody. So if you think you're rich, guess what? There's somebody on the internet who's richer than you. You have a big house, someone's got a bigger house. You have a yacht, someone's got a bigger. So it never ends. As long as we play that competition game, we're bound to lose. So I think, like you're saying, operating from the sense of lack or this sense of abundance makes such a difference.
Yeah. So you've written this book called Cracking the Leadership Code.
Yes. The 3 secrets to building strong leaders is the subtitle.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, what is leadership according to you, and who is a leader?
Great questions. Two good questions. So for me, leadership is the performing art, and I'll come back to the performing art in a moment, but leadership is the performing art of mobilizing other people to willingly work, and that's important, willingly work towards achieving some shared purpose. So I share that definition. If I can break it down a little bit, I say that leadership is a performing art because ultimately it comes down to our behavior. It's what we say and what we do. And what I call the new school or new generation future leader is it's about creating commitment. It's not about compliance. So that's why it's got to be willing. How do we enroll and engage people in the process? And then achieving some kind of a shared purpose. So that to me is my working definition of leadership. And the question is, who's the leader? Really, leadership is not a title. It's not a position. It's not something you get promoted into. Leadership is a way of being and operating in the world, because anytime that any of us are trying to influence anyone to do anything, that takes leadership. And frankly, it doesn't even have to be with someone else. It can be just leading ourselves. If we're trying to get someone to do something, that someone might be me trying to get myself to do something. And that takes a certain level of self-leadership. So in my mind, we are all leaders every day. Now, we may consciously step into the role of, I'm the senior vice president of ABC Incorporated, but that's just one role. We play it. We're leaders in our families, with our friends, all over. So we're all leaders every day.
Fantastic. I love the choice of your words when you're saying the performing arts, when you're talking about the behavior, mobilizing others, the willingness, and the achieving shared purpose. And as far as leader is concerned, you said it's a way of being, right? So if you look at the behavior, which is an act of doing, and here you're talking about a way of being, if you can example of somebody that you worked with who has demonstrated this art of doing and being in front of you, and what kind of results is he able to create for others
Sure.
where people are willing to move towards
Sure.
that shared purpose?
Sure. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story about a guy named Matt. And what's great about Matt's story is Matt's story transitions from what we'll call the poor leader to a great leader. So when I met Matt, so Matt is a district manager for a global fast food franchise. And the franchisee has about 900 different fast food restaurants. They have 100 different districts. And Matt is a district manager, which means he oversees, I think, about 9 or 10 different restaurants. And when I met Matt, they had ranked all the district managers, all of 100, on a list of performers. And Matt was number one when I met him. I said, so Matt, have you always been a top performer? He'd been with the company about 17 years when I met him. He said, no, when I started, I was about 84 on this list. I said, so what changed? Because clearly 84, number one, that's a pretty drastic improvement. So what Matt described, he said, when he started, he said, I used to think of myself as a fixer. I thought that was my job as the boss, as the leader. It was my job to tell people what was wrong and tell them what had to do to fix it. And so I used to show up with this list with everything that was in red was what was wrong. And I'd say, you need to change this. You need to change that. And I saw people as worker bees. I didn't see them as actual people. I just saw them as doers, things to get done. And I did that for years, and I struggled, and I was working hard, and people would quit, and I didn't even know their names because there was such turnover. And finally, he said he had this mentor who told him, he said, Matt, people don't want a fixer. They want a leader. They want someone who cares about them as a person. So Matt shifted. So he started going into the restaurants, and instead of going, this is broken, you need to fix this, what's wrong with this? He'd say, good up. Hey, it's Monday. How was your weekend? What did you do? And then you might say, oh, I spent time with my family. Well, now I know that your family is important to you. And so next time it comes, hey, how's your daughter? I know she turned 7 last week when you told me. Yeah, so he's building relationship with people. And then he'd bring the list with all the red stuff. It's still all red. The things have to get done. But instead of saying, this is wrong, you have to fix this, he'd say, can you take a look at this with me? What do you think we should do? So instead of pushing information at them, he started drawing the solutions out from them. And surprisingly, because they're the ones doing the work, they came up with solutions. And suddenly he had this team of connected, empowered people who are creating better solutions and creating better results. As their results improved, Matt's results improved. And the amazing part of the story, Gaurav, is that he said, now I'm number one, and I am working so much less hard than I did when I was number 85. It's
Mm,
amazing. It's easier to do this now. And I have so much more fun because my work is about people. He said, I used to think my job was to make the numbers. It's like, yeah, you have to make the numbers, but don't put the numbers before the people because it's the people are the ones who make the numbers. But the
mm,
fact is, whether you're in the fast food industry or it doesn't matter what business you're in, we are all in the people business.
yeah.
So that's, I think, a really good illustration of the difference between the mindset and the belief and the
Yeah.
behaviors that needs
And I
to
think
happen.
this example also talks about the shift of the mindset which is required from a mindset that calls for being a fixer to
Yep.
a mindset that calls for somebody who cares and connects at the deepest possible level. And when you're talking about uh, way of being, it means that who genuinely cares and connects with the other person, and that shows up in his action.
Completely. Yeah. Well, what you've just touched on, Gaurav, is the first of the three secrets, which is connection, right? So there's three secrets. It's connection, communication, and collaboration. And
Mm,
to me, the heart of leadership is connection because at its most fundamental, leadership isn't a position. It's a relationship between two
mm,
human beings, the person who leads and the person who chooses to follow. Because remember, following is a choice. And I choose every day whether or not I want to engage fully and offer you my talents and services. So it's a relationship and it starts with connection. And to me, the foundation of connection is empathy. It's that simple human act of showing people that you understand them and that you care how they feel. Now, as I'm sure all of us listening right now are going, well, that sounds very basic. Of course, it's so simple. Unfortunately, particularly in bigger organizations, this is challenging for a lot of leaders because I think what we do is we feel the pressure of producing, getting the numbers, achieving the goal. And in that pressure and the deadlines, we don't have the patience that empathy requires. Because let's face it, we talk a lot about in the world of leadership and coaching, we talk a lot about holding space for others. And if you stop and think about what is holding space really, it means, at least temporarily, taking your own agenda and putting it to the side and making space to be completely present to somebody else and their agenda. And let's face it, for me, and I have kids, so I know this is challenging. It's so much easier said than done to be truly present and allow others to be completely themselves and express themselves. And that's where it starts from. So empathy is where it starts. And it's the basis. Like we said, connection is the
mm.
foundation of strong leadership.
Yeah, yeah. So I've heard a lot of people talking about holding the space.
Yes.
And the three secrets that you spoke about connections, you spoke about communication and collaboration.
Yes.
You could also talk about relationship. I'm just trying to understand what is the difference between relationship and connection?
Oh, well, they're all there. I mean, so the model that I have is there's three concentric circles. So connection is in the center, but then communication comes around it, which means connection is part of communication. And then, so it's not like they're three separate entities. They're actually three completely interdependent pieces.
Hmm.
So that's why. So yeah, so for example, relationship is a key part of connection. It's also a key part of communication, and it's a key part of collaboration because all of this happens in the interchange of that relationship between leader and follower as we build things through. So
Got it. Got it.
yeah.
So, since we are talking about connection, communication, collaboration, just before that, you spoke about the mindset shift from being a mindset of a fixer to
Yes.
to being somebody who really genuinely cares and connects with the other person. What do you
Yes.
think? What are the common assumptions about leadership that can get people into trouble?
Great point. So it's interesting. So the first section of the book, which is called Context, goes into the history of organizational leadership. And a lot of our assumptions and the mindsets that we carry today, they didn't just come from nowhere. They've actually been inherited from generations of leaders before us. Because the fact is, organizational leadership as we know it hasn't existed for thousands of years. It only started at the beginning of the industrial age when we started having large-scale factories built around the world where you had hundreds of employees and the owners had to figure out, how are we going to manage all these people? And the people that they put in charge of figuring all that out were mechanical engineers who saw the factory as an engineer. You'll appreciate this. It's an engineering problem to be solved. I mean, ever stop and think about why do we call them human resources? I mean, what an engineering term that is. Doesn't it sound like we can, like people are these spare parts that we can take some in and swap some out? So the mindset that was built on was based on the idea that management or leadership was doing all the thinking and employees were doing all the work or the labor work. Because back then in the industrial age, 95% of the workforce was doing repetitive manual labor on the assembly line. You know, Henry Ford, who founded the Ford Motor Company, famously said of his employees, "Why is it every time I want a pair of hands, they come with a brain attached?" So literally, this belief was, my job is to tell you what to do, and your job is to shut up and do it. So one of the big beliefs that gets in the way for a lot of people who inherit this new leadership role is they go back and they think, I'm in charge. My job is to tell you what to do, and your job is to basically shut up and comply, for better or worse. Now, we would never say that in the enlightened 2020, but if you look at people's behavior in some not so subtle ways, we see that goes on all the time, whether it's through tone of voice, through body language, even through directness. So that is one of the biggest things that gets in the way, is this idea that my job is to tell you what to do. And basically you just have to shut up and do it. And just, if you don't like it, too bad. It's power struggle, because, it's interesting. I did some research on this. Only about 23% of people say that their leaders lead well, right? That's very few. And why I think that's so interesting. And if you ask a room of 100 leaders, how many of you think you lead well? I guarantee you more than 23 hands will go up in that room. So what this tells me is people feel safe to answer that question on an anonymous confidential survey. They don't feel safe saying it to their actual face of their leader, because in a power dynamic like work where your salary is involved, if you don't feel safe giving feedback, you won't. And that's why many leaders continue on thinking they're doing a good job, but they're actually not. I love this quote from Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize. He talks about the fact that we are blind to our own blindness. And I think that so many leaders, in terms of this idea of giving and receiving feedback, are blind to their own blindness. We don't want to know, and we don't really care. Because if we have the job, do we really want to open up our ego to being questioned? You have to have it's interesting. To be a really effective leader, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Are you willing to open yourself up and ask people, can you give me some honest feedback? How can I be supporting you better as your leader? A lot of people don't want to hear that, because that means you might have to change, and change takes work. So
yeah. As I'm just listening to you and I'm reflecting, I'm sure the way, when you're talking about Henry Ford, right? In that era, I'm sure that kind of leadership would have worked, because it was primarily industrial age, right?
Yes.
However, if you look at today's world, where in India, more than 50% of the people working are below the age of 26.
Yes.
And the way the overall world, the millennials are working, they are showing up at work, it is becoming more and more challenging to deal with them. Not because they are troublesome, it's just that because I have my own mindset. And I've been operating in this world from my own mindset, which is not allowing me to connect with those millennials, right? Now, considering today's uncertain times and the kind of ambiguity which is around us on day-to-day basis, what do you think is the kind of leadership required to deal with this kind of situation?
Well, I think in terms of when we're in this kind of ambiguity, and certainly the crises that we're going through right now, let's say look at this pandemic, I think it's so important to come back to these fundamentals of connection, communication, and collaboration, particularly as you look across the generations. I read a recent survey that the number one reason people give as to why they would leave their job is the inability to learn and grow. Right? So what are we doing as leaders to create opportunities for people to grow and develop? And I think as we think about that, there's a paradox, because organizations in some ways crave stability. We want a certain level of stability, that whatever we are producing, whether it's a product or a service, is that we have some system that's replicable and we can repeat it over time and we can scale it out. And at a certain point, we're doing the same thing again. And so the challenge for leaders is, how do we keep finding ways for people to learn and grow and develop? And a big challenge then for people who are in leadership roles, particularly working with millennials, is to get out of the mindset that I call it the superhero, is you have to stop thinking that you have to have all the answers. You don't. What's great about all employees, but particularly millennials and Gen Z, is you can ask them, how can I help you? How can I support you? And let them co-create the solutions. What we're looking towards is leaders shifting further and further out of that command and control directive style and much more into the facilitative style, that you are no longer the keeper of the information, but you are the facilitator of moving information from where it is to where it needs to be. And seeing your role as, how can I serve people so they can grow, develop, and the job gets done, the work gets done.
Yeah,
But we have to, again, like I said earlier about the fixer and the leader, we have to reprioritize and put the people first instead of the work first, because the people will take care of the work.
Yeah. And Ellie, what I'm listening right now in this conversation is where you are accentuating and focusing a lot on shifting the mindset.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, in your book called Cracking the Code, by any chance, have you also shared a process that could help a leader to bring this mindset shift?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So, I talked about leadership being a performing art. And and I didn't talk about this in my story, part of why I'm so passionate about that is I trained as a professional actor. I actually went to drama school for 3 years. And if you look at actors, there's two different approaches to acting, two general approaches. And it's called either the outside in approach or the inside out approach. Outside in is that you start, if you're playing a character, you start acting the physicality and the voice from the outside in, and then you'll find the soul or the emotional life of the inner character. That's one way to work. The other way to work is to start and try to find the emotional story, understand their autobiography, and then try to build it that way. So I'm a big believer that both work. And so to build the mindset, sometimes the best way to do that is to start to act as if you already have that mindset. So for example, let's say I'm a leader and I struggle with empathy. Well, in the book, I go through, here are 6 different techniques you can use to start building your empathic skills. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Number 1, go into a conversation listening with purpose. So put away your agenda and go in there with the focus as, I'm going to seek to understand somebody else as deeply as I can. And I might even need to create some question prompts for myself, like, what's the biggest challenge you're facing right now? What's on your mind? How can I support you? Right? Just some big, broad, open-ended questions. Because again, if I'm not a coach or a facilitator, this may be very uncomfortable for me. So I want some prompts to help me. Give me some scaffolding to support my structure. So that's one thing people can do. And another key piece to being connected is people have to believe that you're credible as a leader. So some basic, simple behavior that you can do is, are you showing up to your meetings on time? Right? Because that sends a very clear message. When you're on time, that tells people you care about them. When you're not on time, you send a very clear message. Something else was more important to you. So there are ways to break down where suddenly you're acting as if, and then suddenly you take on the mindset. It's interesting because mindset and those core beliefs are in some ways the most challenging things to change. And I don't think just
Indeed.
reading a book is going to do it, frankly. I think what you really need to do is either with a coach or somehow on your own, you need to reflect. And until the stakes are high enough that you say, I need to change, the way that I'm working isn't working, you're probably going to basically read through this stuff as a checklist and say, yeah, do that, not do that, yeah, whatever. You're not going to really commit, because let's face it, you really need to commit to these things for them to.
That's like a metaphorically I often share with people that you don't learn swimming by reading about swimming.
You don't.
Right? You have to swim, you have to dive in, you have to experience the temperature of the water before you learn how to swim and find your way. So, LA, one of the biggest challenges that I've heard people talking about is to manage teams, manage people. What do you think are 2 or 3 ways to address this situation in hand?
Well, one of the things I think is so challenging around managing teams is, first of all, we use the word team for any group of people. And is in fact the group that you have an actual group or a team? Because there's a difference. If there's a bunch of people who happen to be working, they aren't necessarily a team. A team needs to be a group of people that have some shared interdependent outcome work project. And unless you have to depend on the other members of the team to produce that, you're not a team. So first of all, are we a team? And then are we aligned? The other thing is, how big are your teams? Functionally, you really can't have a team with more than I'll say maximum 10 people. I would say that's even too many. I'd say 6 to 8 is great, for largest size. So, when I hear, oh, we have a team of 40 people, oh, come on, it's not really a team. You're not really doing all these things together. And so I would just start there and backing yourself up. And then there's a ton of other stuff, but it's just thinking about what is a team and do we even know?
And what are your views on managing team members? Because team members, as you mentioned, they come not only with a pair of hands, but they also come with a brain. So dealing with the mindset that they have.
Yes. So one of the things I'm a big believer in, and again, I started in this world as an adult learning practitioner. And one of the theories of adult learning is that adults particularly have this huge need to be self-directed. So the more that I can with my team members, instead of pushing and telling them information, is I should do more pulling and asking of them. So if I'm going to present, this is our project, I'm not going to come in and tell them and spell everything out for them. I might give them a broad shape and an outline and then ask them to fill things in. So what do you think this needs to look like? We're looking at trying to, increase our revenue by 25%. Okay, that's the shape. Instead of saying, this is the plan, now go and execute, involve them in the decision-making process. Because when you do, you satisfy their need for ownership. It's one of the drivers of need. So getting people involved and doing much more consulting and pulling and facilitating instead of directing and telling and pushing at them.
So it's primarily more of facilitating,
yes,
more of consulting than directing or commanding, right?
Well, and here's the really interesting thing, because I've had a lot of clients lately talk to me, how do I lead my team now that they're all remote working from home? I said, well, you have to change your mindset in that you now have a team of independent consultants, right? So think about it. Everyone's working from home. You can't micromanage them. You can't see them. What you need to do is you have to set expectations for the outcomes. Now, if some people spend 4 hours a day and some people spend 10 hours a day, that's not your issue. You want to define what the work is, and then how they do it is up to them. But that really starts with this mindset of a results-oriented work environment. So letting go of this, again, I have to work 8 hours a day. That is an industrial age holdover. Where does that come from? They're not on the factory line. I mean, if it takes me more. So again, it's amazing how many of that old industrial age mentalities still are alive and well today.
Yeah. So Ali, help me understand. There are more books written on leadership than there are actual leaders in the world.
Yeah.
If I were to ask you, who according to you are the top 5 leaders, or who according to you are the top 10 leaders, I'm 200% sure that after 5, 6, or 7, you will start thinking about who are the leaders that you really look up to, right? What do you think is the possible reason for the same?
Well, interesting. In terms of who are the top leaders, it's interesting. And one of the books that has inspired me, and you might be familiar with it, is Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner's A Leadership Challenge, right? It's a classic in the field. And what I love about Kouzes and Posner's work is that they took leadership off of the pedestal, right? Because for me, when people would say, who's a leader? I would come up with people like Mahatma Gandhi. I'd come up with Martin Luther King, right? I'd come up with Mother Teresa. And while those are great examples, they're sort of hard to access.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Kouzes and Posner found is in their research was that when we say which leaders have inspired you the most, it always tends to be someone you knew personally. It could be a parent or a teacher or a sports coach, or if you're in your career, a boss or a supervisor you had. So for me, who are the best leaders? It's the people who influence you. And so that's why I'm so passionate about helping everyday people become everyday leaders, because that's the way we're going to make change in the circles of influence that we have. Look at what we're dealing with in the world. We can't wait for the political leaders, the presidents and prime ministers of the global countries to solve everything. Right. And yet there's a part of us, it's that old parent-child dynamic in some ways, that we kind of want some like mommy or daddy to come and rescue everything. And that's not how things are going to be solved. As
Yes.
Einstein said, we cannot solve problems at the same level of complexity as that was, and the problems that we're
Same level
facing,
of consciousness.
consciousness, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so we need to raise the consciousness. We can't
Yeah.
put it outside of ourselves to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So,
And now coming back to a very basic question, there are so many books written already, right?
yeah,
Why did you choose to write about the same topic?
great question.
Why
Yeah,
leadership was talking to you? Why not storytelling? You seem to be
yeah.
an exceptionally great storyteller, right? Why
Oh,
not on executive presence? Why not on coaching? Why not picking up any one topic in leadership? Why
I
leadership?
know. Why? Because it's so broad. The thing is, for me, it's not so much that I sat down to write a book. There's, familiar with causal reasoning and effectual reasoning. Causal is, I'm going to write a book, and here are like 12 chapters, and I'm going to have 4 parts. This book did not come together that way. See, for me, I'd thought about wanting to write a book for years, and I didn't. And then I had this wonderful mentor who said, Alain, writers write. I went, okay. So at the time, I had been working with, I was working with maybe 12 groups a month, hundreds of leaders a month. And then what I started doing was they would tell stories and I would listen to their stories and I would take notes. And then in 2011, I started a blog. And then I just worked at that. And then 2013, and the first 2 years, the blog was terrible. I have to admit, it was terrible. The writing was all over the place. But by 2013, I found a voice and I started publishing one blog post every Saturday. And I didn't miss a Saturday for over 4 years. Well, that's over 200 posts now. So I went back through my 200 posts and I started looking for themes. And so those blog posts ended up becoming these themes: connection, communication, collaboration. And so for me, the way the book is written, it's really designed to, I've had the luxury or the good fortune to be able to spend all this time with hundreds and hundreds of leaders from hundreds and hundreds of companies and get to see so much. So what I realize is that there are these patterns of behaviors, and all leaders, either great ones or mediocre ones, share similar patterns. So I wanted to enlighten people
Mm,
through engaging stories, because I know how people learn. It's through stories, having some data, because there's some people who show me the data. Why is empathy important? Well, it's in
yeah.
there, right? So for me, it was a way to help people to accelerate their own learning curve. And so it was just a way for me to share this stuff in a very accessible way, because look, the principles have been around. And to me, it's less which leadership book do you pick up? It's the question of what are you going to do with those principles and apply them? And my hope is that if the book is more engaging, people will be more inspired to apply them. Because
Mm,
look, we're not suffering for a lack of information. If you wanted to go and lose weight, you can go on the internet right now and find 100,000 different people who will tell you what to do. So it's not that
precisely.
we're not missing information. What we're missing is transformation. And again,
Mm,
and the goal of the book is to, again, the book is not everything, but it's a piece. It's a piece that will hopefully engage people to want to step onto
mm,
the path
mm.
further of personal and professional development. Because until you commit to saying, I'm someone who's going to keep growing, you won't.
Beautiful. Thank you. At the same time, I'm sure you would be on your path to become the leader that you always wanted to be.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what are those traits that you have mentioned in your book and you find it challenging to live by on day-to-day basis?
Oh, what a fantastic question. Some of the things. So for me, I talked earlier about patience. Wow. I feel like I'm continuing to challenge myself to be more patient and to be more open with that. That is definitely one of the things for me is tough. Another thing in the book that I write about in communication is that there's this big gap between what people mean and what we hear. And it's interesting. I noticed that for myself, I have this real strong need to clarify things, and I want to make sure I understand. And when I do that, sometimes people think I get a little, well, not exactly violent, but very passionate about, like, I don't understand that, because I really I want to know, particularly in my marriage. That's a particular one to work on, because, it's the people that you're closest to. It's as easiest to let your guard down, as it were. So that's a couple of the things that I know that for me, I'm definitely working on,
Yeah.
for sure.
So
And yeah,
you mentioned patience and openness.
yeah,
And the second thing is there's a big gap in what people mean and what people hear. So there is a need to understand.
yeah.
I'm just wondering, who would you be without these two needs to get better at, patience and open, and the need to understand? If you just let go of this need to get better at this, what would emerge for you?
As you say that, I just feel like sigh of relief, like just kind of breathing, just more relaxed. And it's interesting because I guess the word that pops up for me, we're having a little coaching session now, aren't we? Yeah. Thank you. The word that comes up for me is I'd be more trusting. And it's funny because who I would be trusting? I'd be trusting myself more. Because I think that part of my diligence, and I call myself a recovering perfectionist because I was that achiever on that path that we talked about earlier. And so part of it as this recovering perfectionist is I would trust that what I'm doing is enough and I wouldn't need to push it. That, you know what, tomorrow I can do good work and tomorrow is another day. And that's okay. In fact, that's something that I've been focused on recently. So I think if I did that, I'd be more relaxed and more trusting, particularly trusting of myself.
So I've got two more questions for you, Ale. One is, if you were to give a piece of advice to your 21-year-old self, what would that be?
Yeah. So the 21-year-old version of Alain was very much a big believer that good work should speak for itself. And what I would tell 21-year-old Alain is you will go farther in life and also enjoy the ride much more if you spend time cultivating relationships. Notice which people you enjoy working with, and when opportunities to work with them again come in, go for it, even if you don't care what the content is, because that's something that I found later in life. I'm much more connected to, I want to work with people who I want to work with much more than what I'm doing. It just makes such a difference to me. So that's what I would tell 21-year-old me.
I'm blessed to have the great people as my friends. And I often share and joke around with them that, let's imagine that we are traveling, we are flying from one place to another, 32,000 miles above ground. And if you tell me that, Gaurav, just jump, I'll not even ask you twice, because I know that before I'm going to hit ground, you will be standing there with a safety net for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think trust is something that makes life so beautiful and so easy and smooth, provided you are blessed with people that you can trust and you are willing to be trustworthy. So, Ale, I'm just wondering, now with the 52 years of wisdom that you have, having trained 10,000s and 20,000s of people all around the world, what do you know for sure with 100% certainty?
What I know for sure is that I don't know everything. What I know is that to keep growing, I need to keep stretching myself and pushing myself out of my comfort zone and asking for both feedback and support. And in fact, feedback is support. So what I know is if I want to keep growing, I need to keep putting myself out there and stretching myself. And there's so much out there that I don't know.
Thank you so much, Ale. It was a sheer honor and a pleasure having you. Thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to interact with you again on some other platform for another beautiful journey ahead.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks.
Take care. Stay blessed.
You too. Thanks.